Hello, my name is Sarah Skaversky. I am a research director at Institute for the Future, where I work in our Foresight Essentials program. Foresight Essentials is really our training professional development arm, where we're trying to build up a community of foresight practitioners and really continue to grow this amazing group of people and the learning that happens amongst us. This activity, this talk, is part of our Foresight Talk series. And really the point of this is to grow foresight capabilities across this incredible community we've been fostering through enhancing our connections, mutual learning, and better connections and awareness of our community needs. So we have incredible people that come in, and today is certainly no exception, incredible people who come in and share their knowledge, their work, everything that they've been doing. Our agenda for today, it's a little bit different. Our other Foresight Talks tend to be 60 minutes. This is 90 minutes. And it's going to start with this welcome. That's what I'm doing right now. A little bit about learning about foresight with Institute for the Future, IFTF. Then we will transition over to a conversation with John Seeley Brown and Ann Pendleton-Julian until we have a question and answer with the audience. And then we will end with a preview of September 3rd, 2 weeks from today at 9 a.m., another 90-minute, session that we'll be having, which will be part 2 of this series. Richard Adler, the host of this conversation, the moderator, is going to be sharing a little bit more about that. We're super excited to have a continuation of this conversation 2 weeks from today. My colleague, Aicha, if you could share into the chat, the link would be wonderful to have the link so people can see where to sign up for that event right now. We'll also be sharing this link at the end and you'll get it afterwards, but want to give you the opportunity to sign up for the special part 2 of this series. Now, a little more about IFTF Foresight Essentials. So IFTF Foresight Essentials is really a portfolio of trainings that we have. It's meant to help you, individuals, communities, organizations, really learn more about how to use and implement and leverage strategic foresight to help navigate and create large-scale change as well. We have different trainings as a whole portfolio. Individuals, we have our IFTF Foresight Essentials training online. We have this in 2-week and 5-week programs online. It's a phenomenal journey. You go through our 22 toolkit. We have IFTF Design Futures. It has its own toolkit as well. It's a wonderful masterclass in design and how do we leverage design in foresight and to immerse people in entirely new experiences. And then we also have Futures Thinking on Coursera, last but certainly not least. It's a specialization. It's a phenomenal entry point into a conversation about foresight. We'd highly recommend you check it out. And then we also offer options for teams. So custom Foresight Essentials online and in person as well. We do Futures Thinking on Coursera, can also be customized for an organization. You can do that at a larger scale, have hundreds of people in your organization have access to that. And then things with Bob Johansen, our distinguished fellow, former president at IFTF on Leaders Make the Future. And then, of course, we have these community features. Foresight Talks webinars, this is what you're experiencing right now. Ask a Futurist webinars, which are with IFTF Futurists. We have certified practitioner meetups for people who have completed one of our trainings. And then we have the Foresight Essentials newsletter, which is open up to everyone. It is phenomenal. My wonderful colleague, Aicha Geralp, helps to curate that, and it's full of really robust and incredible information about practicing foresight. It's a once-a-month newsletter, so I'd recommend joining that. So for today's Zoom webinar, I want to point you to a few features. We would love you to introduce yourselves and make comments in the chat section. One thing to note on webinars, there's actually, the default is just to all panelists. you want to click that and make it to all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, you're just introducing yourself to myself and the wonderful panelists, but it's great to see. We'd love to see where in the world you're joining from as well. If you'd like to ask questions, please do that in the question and answer. So just click on that Q&A, not in the chat feature. That will help us to track that Q&A. You can upvote things, and at the end, we'll be going into a Q&A and we'll be sharing out audience questions. So finally, just so you know, everybody's automatically muted. Your videos are turned off. So you can walk around without pants if you want. But with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to our incredible moderator for this talk, which is Richard Adler. Richard Adler is a distinguished fellow at IFTF, and he also was on staff at IFTF for a decade before the full emergence of the internet, in fact. His research really focused on forecasting the evolution of online communication. And then after leaving IFTF, Richard really pursued interests at the intersection of aging and technology. He's done incredible stuff, joined the staff of SeniorNet, built a network of more than, 250 learning centers all around the country to introduce adults to computers, the internet. He now heads a research and consulting firm in Silicon Valley and is such a special part of our community. In 2006, he was named a distinguished fellow at IFTF, and he's been involved in so many different projects as a research affiliate. So I am thrilled to hand it over right now to Richard Adler to introduce our panelists for today. Richard, over to you.
Good morning or good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here and happy to see that we have a really remarkable audience. I was just looking at the participants, and we have people from Germany, France, the UK, Canada, Kenya, as well as all over the US. So good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. I'm really excited about today. I've had a long affiliation with Institute for the Future, as Sarah said, but I've also known John Seely Brown, who I'm going to now refer to as JSB, as his friends do, more than 20 years ago, and he was the chief scientist of the Xerox Corporation and was director of the legendary Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center. And in the late 1990s, JSB gave me what still remains the best assignment I ever had. In preparation for a meeting of the Xerox board, he hired me to put together a guide on all of the research that was happening at PARC, which meant that I had to go interview the heads of each of the labs at PARC and have them explain to me what they were pursuing, what kind of research they were doing, and why it mattered. And PARC was not a place you could just wander in and chat with, but having that opportunity was really amazing. I continue to work with JSB after he left PARC. We've collaborated on several articles, and for the past decade, I've written a series of reports based on annual meetings, which he's co-chaired of an organization called the Aspen Institute Roundtable on Institutional Innovation. In addition, John's the author of several important books, including The Social Life of Information and The Power of Pull. He served as co-chair of the Deloitte Center for the Edge. And the breadth of his knowledge and the impact, I think, is reflected in the fact he has 11 honorary degrees from institutions that range from Brown University, the London School of Business, the University of Michigan, and most recently, the Rochester Institute of Technology. And so this has been a very important collaboration for me. And then in 2016, I met Ann Pendleton Julian. And this was actually through one of the roundtables at Aspen. At that time, she described work that she had done in analyzing and explaining how General Stanley McChrystal, the head of Joint Special Operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, took on the task of totally transforming the mission and the operations of special operations. It was one of really the highlights of that meeting. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but Anne and JSB were in the middle of working on what was published in 2018 by the MIT Press as a 2-volume, 500-page work titled Design Unbound, Designing for Emergence in a Whitewater World. Now, Anne is an architect by training and is currently on the faculty of the Pardee Rand Graduate School of Public Policy, where she is teaching Design Unbound and is also applying these ideas to actually redesigning the institution of Rand. So this is a very large and complicated body of work, and presenting it in a way that can be useful to an audience of practitioners, but also does justice to the material, was a real challenge to us. And so we've gone through a couple of stages. Now I want to just explain where we are. We started with a standard 1-hour webinar, which is what IF has been doing, but it quickly became clear that that wasn't going to be enough time. So the first request was we expand the hour to an hour and a half. And we worked with that. And then we came up with the idea, well, we couldn't cover the whole book. So Anne and JSB decided to pick a few what they called vignettes to give just a taste of this new way of seeing and a new way of working. And so we're going to start with a couple of those, but as in the last day or two, as we started working through it, we realized an hour and a half wasn't going to be enough either. So what we're going to do is present 2 of these vignettes today, and one that is somewhat broad and theoretical, that provides the basis for the work, and a second which is more practical and applied, a specific tool. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to do a second webinar that will go deeper into this approach and present a very detailed case study that Anne led on how all the tools actually get put together. So I want to get started and turn this over to JSB, who is going to introduce some of the key ideas and insights that I see as providing a foundation for Design Unbound. And then after that, we'll come back and Anne is going to describe one particularly powerful way of applying foresight, which is the practice of world building. So JSB?
Okay, thank you. Moving rapidly from the hyper-local of what it's really like to be in this kayak world, the whitewater world, to not the hyper-local, but now the hyper-global, in terms of viewing a fantastic photograph that was taken around 1972, looking down on the Earth from outer space. It's a famous blue marble photograph. For the first time, the Earth seemed like a single sphere in space. Its surface of geological distinctions and geopolitical borders blended beneath one atmosphere. Seemingly peaceful in a way, it rested in space. Its swirling atmosphere, however, suggests the dynamics of a world not at rest. And it foreshadowed a world of increasing turbulence. Whether you live in LA, London, Boston, Bangalore, we all share a world that is now rapidly changing, increasingly connected, and radically entangled that we will go into. Yes, this is a whitewater world, a world in which everything we do somehow connected to everything else around in this dynamic flows of connectivity. So let's think about this. In a interesting way. Moving from the hyper-global to the hyper-local in a way, if we really look at what's been happening, I think from my own personal experience, we moved in an era from what I'm going to call it more or less the 20th century, which we would often have punctuated evolution that happened every 20, 30, maybe 40 years, governed by a logistics curve in which there was a moment of fantastic punctuated evolution, and then we leveled out for about 40 years working through what this new paradigm was going to be like. And our institutions had to change, our own skill base had to change, and we could build careers around that. In the 21st century, a whole new game. Yes, exponential, we all know that, but we don't kind of realize if you look at this exponential curve, basically it itself comprises a sequence of tiny little S-curves happening in some sense every 18 months. Every 18 months, there's some new type of punctuated evolution that drives us forward. So in a way, our game today is how do you live in this world of constant evolution where paradigms, games, problems, tools are changing. A belief. The challenges we face today are both fundamental and substantial. We have moved, obviously, from an era of equilibrium to a new normal of constant disequilibrium. Our ways of working, our ways of creating value, our ways of innovating, in fact, must be reframed. The whitewater world captures that. To us, it's a world where things are rapidly changing, radically contingent, and hyper-connected. We want to kind of dig into this a little bit. The bottom line, being hyper-connected changes everything we want to assert. And most of us have already lived through multiple ways that's really true. What does this mean in more detail? Today, it is prodigious explosions of different kinds of connections that digital technologies have enabled. Connections, of course, in finance, trade, information technology, biology, and the innovative combinations that follow these and others fast with fresh links. This has created a new kind of network society, one way beyond what Manuel Castells originally described as a network society. Yes, our network society today is qualitatively different. In fact, power is shifting. We're seeing a shift in which power is simultaneously both broadly distributed and profoundly concentrated. We're seeing historic concentrations of power in the platform economy and in individuals of new technological cast that is not only associated, of course, with the platforms, but also with innovations in all sectors through the sophisticated technological know-how. This new concentrated power is adding a distinctly new set of actors with their own associated motivations and values that we need to kind of be able to interpret, understand. Yes, this is an era of being hyper-connected, but the hyper-connectedness is the problems. We're now tied to one another in ways we cannot see through webs of finance, disease information, and we're more closely we're bound, the more vulnerable we become. Networks propagate and even amplify disturbances. Worse, the more efficient these networks are, the faster they spread those dangers. And as we're all in lock-in today, we know multiple versions of this. Going back to John Muir, famous naturalist, there is no special sphere of the environment, no distinct lands of oil, no detached global economy, and no separate issues of public health. When we try to pick out anything by itself, guess what? We find it hitched to everything else in the universe. This presents a new set of problems calling for a new set of tools. Hyperconnectivity, in fact, creates a world of entanglements. We are, in fact, moving from the age of enlightenment to the age of entanglements, as Danny Hillis, the father of the connection machine, pointed out some time ago. We're leaving behind a simple age of enlightenment. Amazing. Leaving behind the age of enlightenment, but causality and reductionism absolutely reign supreme. And guess what? We're entering the age of entanglement. Reductionism no longer works, and maybe even our primitive notions or our sophisticated notions, the causality, don't handle the whole story anymore. This era might be characterized by being complex, constantly morphing and adapting systems problems. Most of our problems today are wicked problems. Wicked problems. As soon as you start to solve them, guess what? They morph. The catch-22 of wicked problems is that you cannot learn about the problem without trying solutions. But every solution that you try has lasting, unintended consequences. So much for reductionism. Unintended consequences that are likely to spawn new wicked problems. Polyarchic, polycentric, polymorphic, and polylemic. Polymorphic, think about it. Basically, the nature of the problem solves as you touch it, and so on and so forth. These polys really challenge us to move radically beyond reductionism to understanding how things are hyperconnected and radically contingent on the entanglements that live here. Problem environments are not solvable in any normative problem sense. Our game now is how do you actually honor this new set of highly entangled problems that we all face today, where many of the techniques that we've learned before don't work. Where in the past we got away with saying, oh, that's just kind of an externality. Let me take this as the kernel problem, put it in this beautiful box, and I will solve this beautiful partial differential equation and tell you the answer. Oh yeah, there are some externalities, and they may have unintended consequences, but they don't really matter. Today, we have to flip that box in some sense, inside out. Go to the World Economic Forum. Look at the global risks and how they are now folded into each other. This diagram, going back to the Great Eastern Japanese earthquake, just begins to show the depth of the entanglements that are involved. And anything you touch here to try to fix it has things that propagate all over. So how do you engage? How do you have agency? How do you influence? How do you have impact even? These are the questions that now dominate us in this kind of whitewater world that we're talking about. We need to have the ability, as Joshua Cooper Ramo would say, we need to have the ability to look at any object and to see the way in which it is changed by connection. Whether you are commanding an army, running a Fortune 500 company, operating a supply chain, fighting a virus, planning a great work of art, or even thinking about your child's education. We have to look at what those entanglements really suggest. We claim in this new age, we need to go beyond even what Ramo was talking about, because what we really need is an ability to see, but see for understanding. How do you start to penetrate those links and understand what those connections really do mean? This is decidedly non-trivial. In fact, it first suggests that maybe we're moving more and more from reading content to reading contexts. We have to learn how to read the context of the problem. And how do you read a context? But often by probing it and seeing how it itself responds. Yes, old operating frames are kind of insufficient. We do need a new way to look at things. We need a new window. Maybe we need a new operating worldview as part of that window. Yes, Newton mechanics with their wonderful laws found us powerful ways to explain things and to have nice causal impacts as we designed. Newton's laws got amplified, and we moved to looking at evolutionary processes, not laws, but processes, operating on top of those laws, if you wish, through Darwinism. But we want to actually suggest that we now need a new window, a third window framed by understanding in a fair amount of detail complex adaptive systems, thinking from a perspective of ecology theory. In ecology theory, mutual interdependencies among all the agents in the system, chance, novel, perturbations, tipping points, exchanges versus causal laws, causal processes and models, not formulas. How do we actually begin to think about these things as these huge networks of exchanges with fantastic feedbacks, operating at different timescales, all embedded within each other, entangled with each other? This is a third window and requires thinking about some of the learnings we could take from the ways that these exchanges, these huge networks actually operated. But now having to fold in notions of causal adaptive systems. How do these, these complex adaptive systems actually work? What are those interactions really like? But unfortunately, it's a little bit more complicated. Seeing for understanding is not really quite enough. We have to go one step further. We need to have the ability to look at any object and not just see for understanding, but now we must also see with imagination. We must see in terms of how things might change as we touch this, and so on. And so this whole sense of now seeing with imagination becomes key to operating in this white water world, driven as much by ecological theories, by this third window, by complex adaptive systems, and so on and so forth. Said quite simply, it is our belief that the imagination now is simply more critical than ever. And in fact, I think we can say that we are experiencing a crisis of imagination to understand how to imagine what these entanglements really do, what propagates to what small moves here get amplified over here, what are the feedback structures, what goes critical, subcritical, and so on and so forth. This is our challenge. In a world that is rapidly changing, the need for improvisation and the need for adaptability and resilience. Operating on this kind of need to imagine. In a world that is broadly connected, a world that is increasingly heterogeneous, the need to imagine oneself in another's shoes, and more in terms of the wicked problems, how these wicked problems are getting bigger and more intractable. How do you start to play with and become a part of being able to feel and sense and imagine what various ways a wicked problem spills out, touching a lot of other things. In a world that is radically contingent, the problems and opportunities are contingent on contexts. Again, contexts that are always themselves changing. Complex problems are contingent on other complex problems. Opportunities are contingent on other opportunities. Yes, we have moved into a world that is radically contingent. Whether one is interested in agency within one's own life, agency in leadership, agency to work on some of the most complex social problems, agency involves seeing more, seeing better, and seeing faster, working with new tools, new skills, new practices, and critically employing the imagination as a muscle. As a muscle. We'll come back to that. All aimed at desired outcomes in relationship to contexts that are hyper-connected and, of course, ever-changing. Imagination really matters. So we want to actually end this vignette that will then link into the one we do several weeks from now, that really looks at the pragmatic imagination as a new muscle for this whitewater world. We've already sent you a link for this fabulous new paper that Anne has just finished on this, and recommend also the work that we have been doing together for the last few years on the pragmatic imagination in new ways to operate, new ways to think, new ways to be, and to be able to have a new kind of empathy driven by more of an ecological lens. Thank you.
Richard, it looks like you're muted.
Okay, now I think I'm back. I hope everybody got all that. Just a few ideas. You know, as I listened, it reminds me, I've had many conversations with JSB over the years. We were neighbors for a number of years, and I would drop over to his house and sit in his workshop, and we would talk. And every time I would come away, not only would I end up with new ideas, but my perspective on the world and the things that I would be seeing, it would always be changed a little bit. And I've heard this talk a couple of times, and every time, you know, this notion of hyper-connected, rapidly changing, radically contingent has been sinking in for a while. I think it's interesting, on Monday, there was an Institute for the Future webinar that presented the results of a new study that the Institute has done on hyperconnectivity 2030 to 2040. And it looks at a world not only of today, but a world in which 5G is pervasive, in which multiple satellite networks provide essentially the whole world with a fabric of hyperconnectivity, and then begin to think about what that's going to be. So even the hyper-connected, radically contingent, rapidly changing world of today is probably speeding up even further. I have a question for the two of you. I'm just curious as to how you guys got started on this work, because I know each of you individually and each have pretty interesting, distinct careers. But how did you get together and get working on this together?
It could be like 2 hours, but we won't do it as 2 hours.
The vignette answer.
I completely understand that. So John and I met when I was at MIT, and as an architect teaching there, I had over the years begun to work on a series of projects that were increasingly complex problems in graduate studios, which were real world problems that people had asked me to take on, where architecture was not enough anymore. I had to look at a whole range of other things. The entanglement became clear if you're doing a university in Bangladesh with all these different, anyways. So what happened is John was really interested in this. He began to badger me, which is one of his techniques you must know very well, Richard. He began to badger me to write up some of the work I was doing. We got more and more involved in conversing around that work, and it led to a first series of papers, and then it began to lead into this book. Meanwhile, he and I are both part of a group called the Highlands Forum. Dick O'Neill's, it's kind of forward advanced thinkers, and began to become more and more exposed to projects that we had done and people that we knew intimately had done where they had succeeded against odds. So the goal was, how do we begin to put together a kind of new tool set that allows us to work forward? The one thing we talked about yesterday, Richard, is that what might look like as theory, especially what John just presented, is not meant to be an intellectualism for us that makes us happy. It's this notion of using tools, as all of you must know, are only as good as how you adapt them. And so what this book tries to do, this work tries to do, is not only give you the tools and the case studies, but to actually talk about how do you see the world differently so that anyone using them can actually have efficacy, can actually make it work. Because it's also, how do you actually look at the world differently? So it's been a 7-year conversation. There have been 3 versions of this book pre-published.
And, you know, I mean, it is a formidable work. And the phrase that I picked up from you that really helped me to understand this is that you think of it as a system of books. I wonder if you just say a word or two about what that means.
Well, first of all, they're sitting behind you. You might point to it, Richard.
Yes, right here. Well, first of all, this is the MIT version. These 2 very fat, kind of off-putting volumes, 500 pages.
Oh, stop saying off-putting and complicated.
Well, it was. I didn't read them because it just sat on my bookshelf. But then I got these lovely small volumes that really each one it can be consumed in 1, maybe 2 sittings. That is really much more approachable and consumable. Really is a system of books.
It is a system of books. What happened is that people don't read the same way today. I'm consistently, John's reading 12 books at a time. I'm reading 5 books at a time. This is actually valuable because you begin to interbreed the ideas. And so our book was actually designed as 5 books, 3 chapters each. MIT Press, we adore MIT Press, but that was too complicated for them to do 5 books. And so you get these 2 large tomes, beautifully designed. But we came away unsatisfied and began to realize each chapter kind of operates like a lot of books today, where you get an idea, a bunch of case studies, and then you sum it up. That's what kind of each chapter is. So the idea was to print each one separately, and like a deck of cards, you can shuffle them, because it's never been intended that you have to read this sequentially. There's a map at the beginning that says different entry points, because there are people who are in organizational theory are going to enter one place, art designers might enter somewhere else, futurists might want to enter somewhere else. You can enter in different places and kind of jump around. And so you could shuffle the deck and start where you want.
Are the individual books orderable from you?
Yes. Well, the Audible, the site was just put up, desunbound.com. You can order, 2 of them are free downloadable and the others can be ordered. They're really at cost. There's black and white versions and color versions.
So I want to move on to the next presentation, which is more sort of practical and I think links very nicely to the whole practice of foresight. But I just want to remind the participants, if you have questions or comments as we're going along, please submit them. And then after Anne's finished, we're going to leave time for some Q&A. So I suspect that people probably are going to have some questions. So Anne, let me turn it over to you to talk about world building.
Sure. So this is vignette 3. The reason it's vignette 3 is because after we built the 4 vignettes, we decided best to put 1 and 3 together. They worked well together, and 2 and 4 together. 1 and 2 being more the principles, 3 and 4, 3 being a very powerful tool, world building. 4 is a case study that actually pulls it all together. So next week will be, in 2 weeks will be 2 and 4. But world building can stand on its own. So I'm hoping, my understanding is that many of you have real familiarity with world building. So I'm hoping that this presentation gives a little bit more in addition, and you'll recognize, of course, John Anderton, the clip from Minority Report, which is probably one of the funniest clips in the movie. If you remember, what happened is he had done some dirt to a doctor who he then went back to later to actually get an eye transplant so that he could become more incognito. And the doctor gave him a transplant of a Japanese gentleman's eyes. And so he now there's a disconnect between who he is and the name that he's recognized as, which means he's not really as incognito as he thought. So it's all kind of very, very funny. Just to give you a little context, I'm going to go pretty quickly because there's material here, and as a vignette, the idea is to give you a window into this. For me, my introduction to world building is when I was Dean of the School of Architecture at Ohio State, and we brought in Alex McDowell for one of our really prestigious lectures, and I met Alex McDowell at that point. If you know Alex, he is a production designer responsible for Minority Report, The Fight Club, The Crow, Watchmen, Man of Steel. I mean, he really is someone who has worked in many different kind of veins of world building. That was my introduction to world building, and then I'll talk about this in a little bit. But Alex and I worked together when he was first hired at USC to create this lab. And I said, Alex, why don't we do a studio together? He said, what's a studio? And we went from there and actually began to codify his process. He's a practitioner. So we codified his process. And that is where I come at it. That's how I come at this. I've then been using this process for real world building of varying degrees of complexity and varying degrees of kind of how close it is to reality or not. But this is a quote that we wanted to start with. It's actually, we start the entire volume with it, is we were at Aspen, JSB and I, and one of the Tim El-Hadady, the director of the Middle East Leadership Initiative, said, got very frustrated at one point. He said, the world has just come together too quickly. We really have little understanding of its true diversity. And then our good friend John Rendon said, who's a global strategist, said, we're forcing the past as a solution set, but the past as a solution set is not anymore a viable option. We need a new tool set. And that led to the kind of real impetus for the final version of Design Unbound, which has a series of chapters which are now separate. And this comes from the system of books, one of the cards, and this is world building. So I'm going to talk about world building today. Why is world building a good idea? And I think this is really important. It's because the actual limits of what is achievable really depend in part on the beliefs that we hold about what sorts of alternatives are viable and available to us. World building can make a whole range of viable and even not so viable possibilities, things we would not consider. It can make them tangible and available for consideration. So it's a catalyst for reimagining reality. The science fiction writer Dave Brin has said science fiction, which is different than world building, as you know, its value in the past has been to critique and create error detection for people in power. So science fiction is often stories that are about creating self-preventing prophecies. And Dave talked about 3 major films, On the Beach, Dr. Strangelove, and I forget the third one, in which these really turned around the destructive train of nuclear armament. So while science fiction is writing stories that are meant to be foreshadowing and warnings, world building, on the other hand, is building whole worlds for us to see futures that are not just what our fears are, but are viable alternatives. And so you've probably all seen this futures cone that was actually done. It's Joseph Foros' diagram, but it's based on a model by Hancock and Basold, and Charles Taylor, who interestingly enough was a faculty member at the US Army War College. He was a strategic futurist who in 1990 proposed this cone. And the way it works is that the tiny little baby circle at the middle is what we think the future is. It's probable. A lot of scenario planning works in that vein. It takes the trends that are probable, it works with the most probable ones and works off of it. If the largest cone is everything possible with parallel universes and all the things we don't know about, there is another zone which is inside of that, which is plausible, meaning it may not be probable or even viable, but under some circumstances, it might be able to be plausible. We're interested in the preferable, not just the plausible, but the preferable. Okay, so what is world building, or is it world building? I'm not going to get into that, but when I talk about why people do world building, there are different worlds for it, and I've had countless hours of conversation about which one it should be. I tend to take world building to put it together. It's a form of speculative design that aims to expand the scope of the endeavor of speculation beyond objects, building whole worlds that we consider viable. It's a visionary practice that allows us to see, construct, and then to play with entire worlds and the stories that emerge from them. So it allows us to speculate in great detail on alternative futures, and it allows us to explore controversial subjects. It's a vehicle for wrestling with complex, often intractable, also known as wicked problems. I use it quite a bit on that. It's this idea of whole worlds that you play in to see what might happen as things entangle. It's about imagining coherent new contexts for things to happen in. It appeared in the vocabulary of literary studies and science fiction in the 1970s. It then made its way into cinema and digital game design. But building worlds, kind of designing rich, coherent, highly detailed and scalable contexts across diverse domains, really has a much longer history. You know, from the kind of intricate world scale, real place context described by Charles Dickens or James Joyce or even Steinbeck, to Borges, Swift, on to Alice in Wonderland, and to the science fiction future worlds of William Gibson and others, building worlds has allowed writers and designers an expanded dimension in which to engage readers and viewers. Beyond telling compelling stories that engage us through empathy for characters that are embedded in a storyline, we're looking at empathy with whole worlds. It presents evocative contexts that draw us in, and we participate in those worlds to test them out and see what might happen. One senses that one's in the presence of world building when seemingly gratuitous details that are not part of the storyline, and this is really important, when they begin to even sometimes upstage the storyline. As Alex says, he says, you know, in a good world build, if a character goes right, you know what's left. You know what would have happened if that character had gone left. He also talks about they build these whole worlds and they'll build the entire model for it and maybe use 50% of that world, okay? Harry Potter, for instance, a whole world that other people can put stories into. So here in Blade Runner, where Harrison Ford is reading a newspaper article, the fact that it's written in Chinese, Spanish, and English says a lot. The farming on the moon says a lot. So it's these details that are critical. Or the kind of origami, the paper origami, the origami unicorn, which is actually the whole clue to Blade Runner. World building can occur in many ways. When it's successful, it draws you in. So Steven Spielberg's AI was mostly a story, but when they built The Beast, which was an ARG, an alternate reality game, to market it, they began to create an entire immersive world. I don't know if you've ever looked at the poster for artificial intelligence, but if you look at it, there's a credit to a person, sentient machine therapist, Janine Sala. This is the rabbit hole. This is the gateway into an entire alternate reality game, which in the end led to, in real life, there was a march in Chicago that was all about AI rights, robot rights. The way in is you simply Google Janine Sala and it brings you into an entire story that you participate in and a kind of thing you have to work out. Harry Potter, all of the stories that have been written in addition to the prequels that have been added, the fan fiction around Harry Potter, much of it actually socially relevant. So it's really a shift from stories to contexts. Instead of building sets, you build worlds, and doesn't result in storyboards, but encyclopedias. It's a process of construction. And in world building, the house or the set is much larger than what you see. It's about starting with a what if X, and then building it out as if it really existed, as if it really existed. So world building is about designing and imagine coherent new contexts that scale. The core concepts is that it's rich, it's vast. You build it across many, many domains. It's vivid. You give tremendous detail and texture to all of those domains. By domains, I mean everything from technology to geology to geography to clothing to food to the politics to the social systems, across all of the domains of the world. It has to be coherent. You build it around an idea, and everything has to play into that, and it's immersive, and that's why you can always add to these worlds. What's really, really interesting about it when it comes to building futures is that at one of the TED Talks, David Brooks said, it was at their, I forget which, their last anniversary, it's especially relevant for future building. David was talking, he was saying that the speakers, he had a real problem with TED Talks because many of them are working on some creative project, whether it's to invent new bionic limbs or new telescopes, new fusion reactors. But he says that the speakers generally live in hope and have the audacity of the technologists, and there's a certain suspension of disbelief. But the problem he had in the end is that it really wasn't, he was much more taken by Sting's take on it, because Sting got up and he said, you know, most TED Talks are about the future, but Sting's was about going into the past. The difference between the two modes of thinking stood in stark contrast. In the first place, it was clear how much richer historical consciousness is than future vision. He said, when we think about the future, we don't think about the texture and the tensions, the particular smells, shapes, conflicts, the dents in the floorboards. So this contrast between future thinking, which is hopeful often at the TED Talks and very much whatever, and then this kind of rich past memory. He said, historical consciousness has a fullness of paradox that future imagination cannot match. But I'm going to claim that world building is about creating vividness with all the texture, richness, and paradox of a memory, and in a framework of coherence. And that's really important. Why do people world build? And this is a kind of spectrum that I built, because as I started dealing with world building, I would go to different people and they'd say, no, that's not world building, this is world building. We world build for marketing, that's world building. Another one would say, no, world building is about fiction. So I actually began to realize it's many things. I built a spectrum. The idea that one is motivated for fantasy, delight, and horror. We're talking about Harry Potter, Tim Burton's Alice, the Blair Witch Project, or more complex, it might be interrogating the world you live in, real place context, historical reconstructions, humor and social critique. So Gulliver's Travels does that. Lewis Carroll's Alice does that. Upside Down does that. Thomas More's Utopia, I'm going to claim, does that. We have Lincoln here as well. This is historical reconstructions, richer than story. It's about playing out fears and hopes. That's The Matrix and Blade Runner. But it's also about prototyping the future. That's where we get to Minority Report. And where it gets really interesting is about speculating on the future, creating hypotheses around big ideas and playing them out. And that's where real world building. But of course, all of these things get mixed up and jumbled. So there is a broader application. This is what I want to talk about. It is a visionary practice that allows us to see and to construct in detail alternate futures, explore controversial subjects, and it's a vehicle for wrestling with these problems. I'm just going to briefly go into the practice. This was as Alex and I codified what he did at Minority Report so we could teach it. This is how he does it. I think Minority Report is such a great movie to talk about because Steven Spielberg was not interested in the other pieces. He was very much interested in how do you prototype a possible future. And that was what was really critical. So Minority Report is this 2002 neo-noir science fiction film, loosely based on a 7-page short story by Philip K. Dick. It's primarily set in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia in 2054, where pre-crime, a specialized police department apprehends criminals based upon foreknowledge provided by 3 psychics called precogs. So that's it. So what Spielberg did is he said, I'm not interested in a utopian or dystopian story. I'm interested in prototyping the future by taking all of the people doing the most advanced work, much of it not yet possible, but certainly on the edge and viable. And he pulled together in 2 days what was called the Ideas Summit in 1999. And the people he brought in, you can see here. We've got Peter Schwartz, the futurist. We've got Neil Gershenfeld, the computer scientist. Under Koffler, Alex McDowell was, of course, there. Copeland, the novelist. Brandt, the futurist. So you see that the biomedical researcher, screenwriters, architects, planners, and many more. They met for 2 days, and they began to say, in the future, this could happen, that could happen. Alex then took it and began to pull it together. But to do this, these are the 5 steps that we codified from Alex's process, starting with what if, why not, and getting to as if. You have to say what, why not, because you can't say, no, that could never happen. So you begin with a what if, which is a speculative proposition, and there are different kinds of what ifs. You determine the logic points. These are the assumptions that the world will work by. You then map the domains you want to, which are containers for kind of cascading expert-specific questions. You answer those questions to build out the domains. So you create the world's detail and texture, visualizing the world as if it is real. And then you use stories that intersect with that world to test it for coherence, change it, and to see if you play in that world, what happens playing in that world. So in Minority Report, what if you could know your future? Would you want to? Is the question. And then the logic points, or the assumptions they started with were, it's set in Washington, D.C. in 2050. That comes from the Philip K. Dick story. It was to be a plausible future. That was Spielberg's mandate. Not inherently dystopian, another mandate. Technology is ubiquitous. That's a simple trend that you would use in scenario planning. Precogs and pre-crime unit makes the city a safe place to be. That again comes from the story. But this they added, and this was new. Precogs can see 50 miles, and so the city has a 50-mile radius. This is really interesting, because what's interesting is not all assumptions are equal. It's that last one that started the cascading progress. If precogs can see 50 miles, and so the city has a 50-mile radius, because 50 miles are safe, people are moving into this 50-mile radius, but at the same time, what happens, I'm going to go back to the other ones, it's Washington, D.C. Washington, as you know, has a height limit, so they have to build across the river. So you've got all of these people in an increasing population moving into a 50-mile density. All of a sudden, the city has to go vertical. If it's a vertical city, then you ask, what's the infrastructure? It has to be vertical highways. If you've got vertical highways, what kind of cars? And you can see it all cascades from those assumptions. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Because the third thing is then to map the domains. A domain is so this is the kinds of maps that Alex would do. So there's a whole bunch of kind of material things, like what's the physics of the system? What's the biology? What is the landscape? What's the climate? What's the technology, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's the mental things like identity, beliefs, ideologies, language, social. What's the social system? What's the technology? What are the politics, et cetera, et cetera. So in Minority Report, sorry, turn the pinging off, you begin to then build out these domains and texture detail. So here's the architecture. There's the technology unit that comes with the precogs. So again, the idea of the gloves, the idea of this kind of visualization was not possible at the time, but it was being given by what was going on. Here you go. If it has to be a vertical city, it's got vertical highways. So how do you navigate? What's the technology? Lexus was looking at cars. This is maglev technology. How do you transfer from the horizontal to the vertical? What became really, and then what do the houses look like? You have a house on the right. What became very, very interesting is at one point they decided they needed to do a chase scene. This is where serendipity comes in. And they created this amazing chase scene, which is again gratuitous. But it begins to show how all of the parts of that vertical highway intersect with the architecture around it. It deals with the drug problem that he had. What are the drugs? Gratuitous detail. How do you can't park on the ground and then move up, etc. It deals with marketing. It deals with, and again, this idea of marketing wasn't part of the story. Security is of course part of the story, all the way from vehicles that are like pre-industrial or post-industrial looking to the little spider robots. And then you begin to land stories. Personas and characters inhabit the world as if it is real. So here they started with a story, a loose story, and they began to build it out, and then they filled out the story. Another way to look at it is the idea, this was a sketch that Alex and I did when we were in one of the favelas in Rio to talk about this. You spread horizontally, you go vast, then you go deep with all of the different questions, rich. You land the stories. You want to test the world for coherence, because if a story can't move through that world, if there's a disconnect, you have to revise it. And then you add more stories playing in the world to see what it can do. So in real world world building, if you're going for a future alternate state, it's got to be coherent, it's got to be rich, and then you've got to see what it can do for you. And that's what's really important. Products of world building, maps, encyclopedias, Bibles, games, and artifacts. This is the Bible for Minority Report. Each one of those circles is a different thing. This is a kind of color 8.5 by 11 document. It was actually an encyclopedia where each of those elements, this is what the car would look like. This is what clothing would look like. This is what plants or biotechnology looks like. This is what X and X looks like. I worked with Alex. This was our very first studio we did together when we codified this. It was called Relau. It was a very exciting premise. It actually started with, I was very interested in looking at cities, Rio especially in LA, and originally we wanted, we couldn't decide between Rio or LA, so we did both. Relau, Rio, LA. I wanted to look at cities within cities where these are different socioeconomic conditions. So you have the favelas, which are coherent structures of their own, of a kind of different class than the rest of the city. The same thing with LA, you have that. We created a wonderful kind of story that came from Saramago's Stone Raft, in his story, a piece of Portugal broke off and went into the ocean. So we said Rio had an earthquake, floated into the ocean. Piece of LA had an earthquake, floated into the ocean. They collided in the ocean, stopped their movement, and they were disconnected from the continent for 50 years because there was a plague. And how would that city now begin? How would that begin to develop? It was a series of islands that were terraformed. Here's the map. There was the Lao chapters, which is the mythology. This was a virtual reality experience that was to indoctrinate people, Laoans. This is part of that virtual reality experience. This is the whole terraforming idea. How does it terraform? We had architects, we had screenwriters, we had product designers. This is a beautiful, beautiful piece by an architect using the whole idea of the kind of art movements and the festivals. And it uses the kind of bioprosthetics. It encloses you completely and then opens up to create space around you. So it had to do with There was amazingly a wonderful game built, because in the end we worked with a dozen, after the first semester, after the first thing, we worked with a dozen different universities, Royal College of Art in London. We created a game to be able to do that, and we then had an exhibition around it. Oops, sorry, going back. Okay, so real world building is about desirable, not default futures. It supports designing and decision-making in the present aimed at the future. We use this technique to do it, this process. Some of the examples: the future of the university is a design problem, which we did with Georgetown University, the first Wicked Problem Studio, which then led to the president of Georgetown creating the Futures of Georgetown University World Building, which they're actually implementing or working on. Maine K through 12 education, the future of the research libraries, which is the project we will talk about in part 4, in vignette 4. A new model for public policy education with the Pardee-Rand Graduate School of Public Policy redesign. This is the vehicle. This has been 4 years I've been working with them. We've been implementing it in action. I would talk about that, except I don't have enough of that written. In action, we've completely changing the practice of public policy. This is the first year in which we've got all of the components in the system. Using it for homelessness in greater Los Angeles, looking at what is a better state of the problem. This has been extremely needle pushing or boundary pushing, what we've done. San Diego 2049, the future of work worth doing in the post-AlphaGo world. We're doing with Rand and with Stanford. That's ongoing. And the Yukon 2049, above the 60th parallel, which is my favorite project at the moment, because if you're looking at any of the geopolitics with the melting of the ice cap, this is a place in which the geopolitics of the region are changing so quickly. If the countries in that region don't take control of their own future, it will happen to them. Okay. World building is like and unlike these different things. I usually go into why. I'm not going to do that here for sake of time, but I am going to say the real main difference, as I see it, is it's about creating vastness and vividness, the dense and the floorboards with all the texture, richness, and paradox of the memory. It's a coherent world, and you test the world through stories. It's really about widening the aperture on possibility. It's like those other things because it uses parts and pieces of all of them. But it really is about really widening the aperture, not starting here and moving forward, but jumping out. And then the real question becomes, once you've got the world built, then what? How do you get from here to there? And that's what we're going to talk about next week, which is another powerful tool. But again, if you in 2 weeks, if you can't come, or if you want to just this is what it's about. It's a tool called Systems of Action, which is an ecology of action, not a theory of change. It's about an integrated system of components to get you from A to B, understanding that we're having to design for a system in motion, not for anything static. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. I'm going to stop there. So this is what we'll talk about next week. We're going to look at 2 case studies. I keep saying next week, I mean 2 weeks. One which was what we extracted and was able to make generalizable what the system of action was. El Sistema, which worked against all odds to create amazing transformative change. What we learned, and then how we began to directly apply it. And I'm going to stop there. And stop sharing my screen, I guess, right? Is that what I do? Stop sharing. Okay.
Richard, looks like you're...
Okay, I'm back. Well, I have a zillion questions, but I'm going to refrain because we're running a little bit short on time, and I'd like to bring Sarah Skversky back and provide a time to bring in some of the questions from our audience.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been really so fabulous, and I'm seeing a lot of lot of colorful questions. I'm going to start with a logistical one that seems to be coming up a lot, and then I'm going to get to the content one, which is if it's available, if there are PDFs available of these chapters. I know that there's PDFs of the free download ones, but there's a lot of questions about, can you get PDFs of the world building chapter, for example?
So there's a PDF free downloadable of that went through what John went through there. There isn't. They're absolutely buyable. The black and white versions are $7. So if you go to desunbound.com, you can actually order the chapter. Color ones are a little bit more money.
Thank you. And now on to, there have been a lot of interesting questions around imagination, types of imagination, imaginations that are forced upon us. And just the idea of, I know, Anne, you showed that, I forget what it was called, the Design Summit, or whatever, that summit in the 90s looked like it was almost all men. We had an addition of at least one woman in the chat. Thank you, Tim, for adding that. But we'd love to think about, the different contexts and worlds and the different people coming together. How do you create space and context that allow for multiple contexts, for more robust conversations? And maybe how has world building changed in recent years as these conversations have become more prominent?
So I think, world building is like any tool, people use it for different things. They have different jobs they want to create. If you're doing real world building, which is really what I'm most interested in, sometimes like Rilao, it's real world in the sense that you're working with a real world problem. You want to really disentangle what's happening in these cities within cities, multiple socioeconomic classes. But the world build around a fiction allows you a permission to not to release some of the emotions attached to it. So that's one thing. Real world building around problems is a different thing. And so when I work on it with different people, of course, it's right. How do you get all of the domains in the room? And it's like building any multidisciplinary team. Of course, you look for the diversity. You need diversity. If you're looking for so many domains, you need diversity of players.
And have you seen any particularly good examples of creating a context where different types of imagination and different types of sort of approaches can flourish together?
Yes. What do you mean by different? What is that? Who is that person? What do they mean by different types of imaginations? I don't know.
So this is from John Beaton. He said, how do you get different people with different imaginations to collaborate together? People with different sort of backgrounds, different types of, worldviews.
Yeah, so, different worldviews is different than different imaginations. Okay, different worldviews. So there has to be a methodology, and this is, we use this kind of idea of conversations with pens. First of all, brainstorming, the social dynamics of brainstorming, I find extremely problematic because there's always the people who dominate the conversation. The other thing is that the other way to do it is as a scribe, there's someone at the front of the room and they've got the big piece and everybody sits down, and I also find that problematic. So we use a technique called conversations with pens, which I'll talk about next week, which is large real estates of white paper, small teams of 4 to 5, everyone has a different colored pen, and everyone's standing, and you're not just coming up with an idea, voting on it, and putting it down. You're literally, everything you're saying, you're writing down. It quickly goes from just words into diagrams. And the reason why we have different colored pens is that I go around the room, and if every pen isn't on the wall, that's my job, to say someone's not speaking, and they have got to be up there. What's really interesting about this, Sarah, is that what we will see teams in which some people will break off because there's an argument going on, and a person will say, fine, they're not allowed to sit down, they'll work somewhere else. And then you'll see the main core looking over what's happening over there, and little by little, the group comes back together. The biggest problem, I've gotten fired 3 times from traditional brainstorming sessions because I wasn't quote unquote, quote, doing it right, right? So the ability to have lots of real estate conversations with pens. The other thing we don't do is we don't come to any consensus there. Consensus is what everyone can agree on, but no one's interested in doing. So what happens in complexity theory, complex adaptive systems, you're looking for patterns and anomalies. So we go back, I take every single piece of paper, transcribe every single word that's on that piece of paper, and put it on a big Excel spreadsheet. And this, whether it's 400 people or 140 people, it happens over how many workshops, never more than 30 people in a workshop. And then I find the patterns, different words, but the same patterns. And the anomalies are most interesting, because when you find the things that are different and unique and anomalous, then, and sometimes they're thrown out as, they're throwouts. Why are we even doing this project? Because of X. That's where you usually find the innovation or the problems. So that's a technique we use, which allows, if you don't have every voice, and if every voice doesn't get recorded, you're really playing into the typical, the general, and those that always have the voice anyways. John's watched these happen. John, do you want to say something?
No, I mean, to me, I'm stunned by what happens after you take these sheets home, take all the transcriptions, and then how do you actually find the patterns? And how do you make those patterns productive and be able to pull out the inherent underlying tensions therein? Yes. And that, to me, is where the secret actually lies.
And what is the secret? What's the answer? What happens there?
It's called imagination.
Well, I'm really curious whether you've tried to do this in the post-COVID world. Have you made any efforts to do this kind of, I mean, one of the questions that's interested me most the last few months is the future of collaboration in a socially distanced world and the Zoom world. You know, what we're doing here is a kind of cool thing that you can do with Zoom, but can you do that kind of collaboration? Have you made any efforts to do that, or are you just waiting for us to get back together?
Well, there's two issues to that. I think it requires that everybody understand that even before you start, you have to get some facility, whether it's Miro or what. You all agree, here's the drawing tool we need. You just got to do that. And it's got to be a collaborative drawing tool. You cannot do this with words. That's number one. And number two, we have to continue to lobby for the social construct of the imagination, of coming together and creating a shared space of imagination. On the wall, it's a conversation. It's not just people listing their ideas. So we have to lobby for that, not just say, oh, now we've got a new world and we're better. We have to lobby for that social space of the imagination, and we have to still be able to draw. But to answer Sarah's question about how do you do that, John brought up the idea that you find the conflicts and paradoxes. When we did RAND, what happened is after the third workshop, so we did 7 workshops in 3 studios. I'm not going to get into that, but I'll get to that next week because that's how we did ARL. When we did it, what happened is I realized there was a conflict that they didn't even know existed throughout RAND. There were a group of people that said, we are the trusted advisor. RAND is a strategic think tank. We are the trusted advisor. We help people answer their problems. We are rigorous analysts. We don't take a stand. And then there's a whole group that said, I came to RAND to change the world. You can't change the world without taking a stand. That led to the big idea for the redesign of the school, where there's now 3 streams of engagement. The analyst, which has been amplified by complex systems, and all of them are under a complex systems agenda. What we call stream 2, let's call them mission critical teams for policy and analysis. That's the people who want to engage, but in a high powered way. And then the third is a technologist stream to begin to be part of all this. When you find the conflict, it's not about choosing, it's about turning it into a productive paradox. Then you've hit the sweet spot of a problem. And I've done this 4 or 5 times. I won't go into other projects, but yeah.
By the way, it's worth noting, and I think everybody on this conversation knows this, but some of the audience may not. The Institute for the Future 52 years ago spun out from the RAND Corporation. So that's when we trace our roots, it goes right back to Santa Monica.
Well, and what's interesting, Richard, is given that there's now two tracks, there's what the Institute for the Future does, and there's the decision-making under uncertainty track. So it's an analytical, let's try to find the 5 constraints we can optimize for. The person who started the design, the decision-making under uncertainty, he and I are now working together. We're adding world building back, and we're doing this kind of work worth doing in post-AlphaGo future. We're going to play with these things. Back to your question, Richard, we're going to play with it. But again, I have said when it comes to our studio that we're teaching, we've got to dedicate a week to just getting up to speed with the tool. Because if you don't have the tools, you can't converse.
And I think that something that you just said really hinted at the next question that I want to get at. You know, you were talking about decision making and sort of narrowing down. And somebody asked, Eugene Couch, I think, asked, you know, what principles from Design Unbound, and you could even get more narrow and say what principles from world building, would you say that apply directly to organizational leadership and how we develop next generation leaders? And I know that you're thinking about that, Iran, too.
Oh, that's excellent. So for was this Eugene you said? What was the name?
Yes, Eugene.
So there's a chapter 17. Design Unbound is a series of 9 tools and 3 meta tools. And what the meta tools are is they are tools that combine all the other kind of tools. They're very powerful. Systems of action is one we will talk about next week. The third one, well, the first one is designing for emergence. The third one is called the Change Triangle 3.0. Systems of action is an ecology of change, a way to get from A to B, where you don't have access to leadership. In other words, you are not leadership, right? You're in the system and you're trying to change it from the inside. The Change Triangle 3.0 is when you do have access to leaderships, or you are a leader, but you still need to look at it systemically. And that uses that's where we talk about the Stan McChrystal. And what Stan McChrystal did as a leader to create radical transformation in JSOC, to go from a hierarchical organization to a network that could fight the terrorists and begin to pull stuff together. And so specifically for organizational change, chapter 17, Change Triangle 3.0, I'm getting very specific, I hope that's what you wanted, is the best place to go.
And as it happens, there is a free downloadable PDF of a roundtable on institutional innovation where Anne and Stanley McChrystal participated. He tells his amazing story of what he did, and then Anne comes in and provides introduces the Change Triangle analysis and analyze it. So we can post that as well. It's not the whole story, but it's a nice kind of summary of it. And it's an amazing.
And it shows the drawing, it shows the diagram and the change triangle. It's kind of there. And to just give a little context, I met Stan through actually his mentor, John Vine, and a group at Aspen because of some work I'd been doing. And they came over to me and they said, I can't believe what you just presented. You are so brave. Here I'm dealing with the people that were SEAL Team 6, right? And they said, you've got to meet Stan. Stan's got to meet you. And I worked with both Stan and one of his task force commanders who were there. And so what Rich is referring to is Stan talks about what he did, and again, we codified it. We began to make it usable for other people. But I think John and I owe such a debt of gratitude. It was such an amazing honor to be able to work so closely with Stan and Coleman Ruiz to unpack this.
And I mean, the headline is, this is a man who took on an incredibly complex organization with deep traditions and rather dispersed in its management and totally transformed it literally under fire. So do we have time for one more question, or we're running out of time?
Not. This is a case of time flies when you're having fun. I did not even realize how far into this we were. We have around 1 minute left, so I'm going to share my screen with the information for what comes next. And so want to open it up to, JSB and Richard. First of all, just want to thank you all so much for this really phenomenal masterclass that you put on, and then turn it over to you to share a bit about what you think will be happening, or what will be happening in 2 weeks' time, September 3rd, 9:00 a.m. Pacific time, at the next session of this. And Aicha has just posted again the link for people to be able to sign up.
So same time, 2 weeks from today, part deux, and we will cover 2 more vignettes. And do you want to just very quickly give us a recap of, so this was 1 and 3 today, next time will be 2 and 4.
Yeah, so what we'll look at next time, the first one will be shorter than the other one, is the pragmatic imagination. I was not just being coy when I asked what are multiple imaginations. The pragmatic imagination really is about how do you instrumentalize the imagination? How do you get it started? How do you just set it in motion, and how do you begin to instrumentalize it? And how do you understand it as a muscle that we all have? We just use it to varying degrees. And that imagination is not just, imaginative versus rational work, that we use imagination as a cognitive process in perception even. And how do we all begin to engage that full spectrum of imagination, and how is that useful as a tool? And then the next one, the Vignette 4 will look at, as I said earlier, a case study from which we drew the systems of action meta mechanism, just as we drew the change triangle from Stan's story. And then actually where we used it, John and I, to work on a project for the future of the research library.
And also uses world building.
It uses world building, and then it also creates the system of action to get from A to B, and how did we set that all in motion? The Association of Research Libraries is the umbrella organization for all of the research libraries in the United States and in Canada.
This is amazing. Thank you all so much. For those of you who are not able to make it in 2 weeks, we will be posting the recording. We always post our webinar recordings 1 week after the Foresight talk. And so we will have that September 3rd, and then the next week you will be able to see that follow-up. And then after that, you can continue your learning with us. On September 30th at 9 a.m. Pacific time, we have the wonderful Madeline Ashby and Scott Smith, who will be here with us to talk about how to future, a practical, tactical guide. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you soon.